Smile is a really weird film. When I saw the trailer, I was expecting a very typical mainstream horror film with every cliche in the book. Basically no character to speak of and mostly just cheap attempts at being creepy or scary. Mostly because the creepy smiles in the trailer looked really goofy to me. And it felt like the trailer only cared about the scares rather than actually selling a story to you. However, I was actually pleasantly surprised by how good the character work in the film was. I mentioned in my last video that horror is great at using the supernatural and horrific as metaphors for trauma and how it often tells stories about the need to acknowledge and confront your trauma and the need to move on from it. Acknowledging its impact on the character but not letting it define them. This is basically the general theme of Smile. The main character, Rose, faced with the trauma of her mother's death, who ended up killing herself by taking pills and drinking alcohol, only to ask a young Rose to help her and that she made a mistake. But then Rose didn't help her mom because she was too scared of her due to her mental illness, which caused her to treat Rose really poorly. The entire film has moments, sometimes more subtle than others, of characters trying to get Rose to confront her childhood trauma, with her therapist saying she has unresolved issues with her mom's death, and her sister saying that Rose hasn't let herself move on from her mother's death due to guilt. Meanwhile, the sister herself doesn't let the past define her. During all this, Rose has constant nightmares about the night of her mom's death. And when we start seeing the apparition of the entity haunting Rose, it takes her mom's form in quite a few instances, haunting her for her trauma. On a character level, this is all great, until the ending anyway, but we'll get to that.
Painful writing.
Horror exploring the idea of trauma isn't new, as I mentioned in the previous video. It's one of the cornerstones of horror. But the way this film explored it was certainly unique enough that it didn't feel like a copy of other horror films. Rose surprisingly felt like an actual character. Though her unquietness was a little too over the top for me, but the way she treats her haunting and the way she realizes she needs to face her trauma to end it all felt well integrated with the story and characterized her pretty well. Never once did I feel like Rose was a caricature. And that was true for most of the characters in the film. The sister and the husband, though, were straight up caricatures in their first scene, but the sister did get a great moment where she says Rose never moved on from their mom's death, which added some depth to her character, showing why she left Rose with their mom as they were younger. However, the trouble comes when we talk about the supposedly scary and creepy aspects of the film. As much as some of the visual effects were pretty solid, when the film was trying to be creepy, all I did was laugh. There's generally not a single creepy moment or jump scare that didn't make me laugh at their attempt to be creepy, and it felt like two different teams were in charge of the film, one for the character bits and one for the horror bits, because the horror was just the most generic and cookie-cutter attempts to scare the audience. The film thinks the visual of someone smiling and staring at Rose is creepy on its own, basically just trying to emulate the Kubrick stare without not really adding anything new to it. And the film also thinks that just having gore and disturbing moments as jump scares is scary on its own, but it's not. They repeat so many times the same type of scare, with a loud noise making Rose drop a glass and breaking it, a voice calling Rose's name, then the jump scare of the entity haunting her jumping at the screen, all that jazz. It's nothing new and it's not scary. There were so many times where I predicted the exact moment the jump scare would happen, and the exact manner it would be done in. I'm not inherently against jump scares, but they're also derivative and lack an understanding of what is unsettling about horror on such a basic level that I couldn't take any of the horror stuff seriously. And the issue is that this problem with the horror aspects bleeds into the larger narrative, which is what I meant about the ending earlier. So, spoilers for the film from now on, but basically, the story of the film is that there's this demon-type entity that haunts people when feeds on their trauma, and it moves from person to person through extreme trauma. So Rose gets the demon because her patient killed herself in front of her, and the patient was being haunted by the demon, so she kills herself and passes it on to Rose. With that, Rose starts to see the same things her patient reported, people smiling and staring at her, those people making her feel unsafe, and then she also starts hearing voices and she starts hallucinating entire conversations because the demon's messing with her head until Rose is ready to pass it on. Considering the demon feeds on trauma, it's quite interesting to see its past victims, and now Rose, were seeing hallucinations of their past trauma. A man sees his dead brother, Rose's patient sees her dead grandfather, Rose sees her dead mother, etc. So the story is tying the haunting in with her past trauma, which, as I've said in my previous video and today, I really like as a way to use horror for meaningful stories. So Rose figures out by the end that the way to beat the demon is to go far from people, because the demon needs to cause trauma to other people so that it can pass on. And Rose needs to confront her trauma because then the demon can't feed on her anymore and it can't jump to anyone else, so it can't survive. Also, it's important to note Rose has an ex-boyfriend who's a cop and has helped her figure out the way this demon works, and he knows exactly what she's going through and believes it to be real. So anyway, what Rose does is she goes to her childhood home, which was cleverly established earlier in the film as being abandoned and in ruins, because Rose wants to confront her trauma of her mother's death. Gearing up for the finale, I kept thinking, please don't pull a cliche horror ending, please don't, please. Because I knew for a fact that the film really wanted to do a generic horror ending, where the monster wins and the cycle continues. But the film set up the third act as a confrontation between Rose and her trauma, and how she needed to accept that she wasn't at fault for her mom's death, and to move on from her trauma, which is a pretty great message, and it works really well with the idea of horror I mentioned in the last video. Up to this point, I was actually pleasantly surprised with the film. I wasn't gonna say it was amazing, but I was quite happy with where they took her character, considering the way they explored the hand her childhood trauma still played in her adult life. So, she confronts the demon and sets it on fire, showing the demon that, while Rose might be trapped with the demon inside her mind, it is her mind, and she controls her own trauma, and she has the strength to move past her trauma. At this point, the film should be over, with her putting her old house on fire as a symbol of letting go of her traumatic past, symbolized more concretely by killing the demon that feeds on trauma. However, the film pulls a horror movie ending. It's hilarious how Zach even managed to predict the ending almost perfectly when I was talking to him about it. She beats the demon, she goes to her ex's place and apologizes for being a bad girlfriend. But then it turns out that it was all a hallucination created by the demon, where she never set fire to it or the house, and she's still being haunted by it. Also, outside of the hallucination, in the real world, her ex shows up at the house, despite not knowing where she was going, despite her never being open about herself with him. So he couldn't know where the house was, and despite knowing that going there could make him see her killing herself and cause him to inherit the demon. So then Rose runs back into the house, trying to keep her ex from seeing her die, so that she can save him from being tormented by the demon. As the demon takes over, all while the ex tries to break down the door to go and save Rose, despite knowing there's nothing he can do. Once he enters the house, he sees Rose smiling, showing she's been taken over by the demon, and that she's now poured gasoline all over herself. And she holds a box of matches and very slowly grabs one to light herself on fire. Instead of turning his back and running away so he doesn't inherit the demon, the ex just stands there and stares at Rose as she sets herself on fire, until we cut to black, implying the ex inherited the demon, and the cycle will simply continue with the demon killing more and more people.
At times like this, we ask ourselves deep questions. Is there a God? How could he let this happen? Who did this to me? Who can I sue?
I absolutely despise this ending. Not only is it going for cheap shock value of, oh no, Rose didn't actually win, the demon won. It's also insultingly contradictory to the theme of moving on from trauma and accepting your past as part of who you are that doesn't define you. It spits in the face of the good and consistent message it was going for because it wanted a horror ending. It wanted to end like Sinister, but the entire film was building up to the opposite. Rather than feeling like Rose conquered her demons, like the film kept setting up as what she needed to and would do, I just feel like her ex is now being haunted because he's stupid. She died because she couldn't face her trauma and her trauma actually consumed her, despite her facing her trauma and showing her mind is stronger than to be consumed by it. It's just so cheap and, on a character level, extremely contradictory to the arc established for Rose since the opening scene of the film. So this is why I think the film is both the best and the worst horror can be. On one hand, the character exploration of Rose and her trauma is surprisingly deep and consistently dealt with in a mature manner. On the other hand, the film doesn't understand how to incorporate the unsettling and scary parts of horror to fit her state of mind without resorting to cheap horror cliches and jump scares, which bled into the character exploration as it ruined the main character's arc in the search for the cliche, thrill-seeking, formulaic horror ending, an ending that it didn't earn whatsoever.
It hurts.
In conclusion, Smile is a mixed bag. It was better than I expected, but it also disappointed me more than I thought possible. I think there's a really good movie somewhere in there, but it was bogged down by some of the worst aspects of mainstream horror. So, while the film is certainly not worthless, it's definitely not worthwhile either.